Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Paul Barber. Our top stories. The Bank of Japan raises the cost of borrowing to the highest level in 17 years after consumer prices rise in December.
Our other headlines, President Trump tells monetary policymakers that he wants US rates to be cut, reviving his fractious relationship with the Fed.
And get your act together. The blunt message from Europe's central bank to EU leaders on their stagnant economies.
Within the last hour, Hamas has named the 4 Israeli hostages it will release on Saturday under the terms of the Gaza ceasefire agreement. The hostages are all women and will be released in return for 180 Palestinian prisoners. Let's talk to our correspondent Jonathan Regev, who's in Tel Aviv. Jonathan, what further details do you have?
So the list, as you said, Jamie, was published in the last hour by Hamas, and Israel says that it is a breach of the agreement. Why so? All 4 women in this list are women soldiers, and the agreement calls for all the women civilians to be released before the women civilians, before the women soldiers. There are still 2 women who are civilians in captivity, and therefore on paper they should have been released before the soldiers, but according to the list the soldiers will be released tomorrow. This could be perhaps, this is of course all open to assumptions and thoughts. Another factor of the ceasefire is that whoever is alive will be released before the hostages that are not alive. This of course raises the concern that these 2 women hostages that we're speaking about are not alive, and that is why their bodies, if this is the case, will be released at a later stage. And this is why we can speak at this moment of course, happiness and joy and hope to see these 4 women soldiers possibly home tomorrow afternoon, but great concern for the fate of these other 2 women. Hamas, we know, also tomorrow is set to release a complete list detailing who is alive and who is not out of the 33 hostages named for the first phase. Therefore, this question could perhaps be answered tomorrow, but of course it raises a major concern. And also the identity of the women hostages released tomorrow will have an effect on the identity and the number of Palestinian prisoners released tomorrow. Why so? For every woman civilian, Israel is set to release 30 Palestinian prisoners, but for every woman soldier, Israel is set to release 50 Palestinian prisoners. 30 of them are people serving life sentences. So, if we will see 4 women soldiers released tomorrow, that would mean Israel would release 200 Palestinian prisoners, out of which 120 are people serving life sentences. This is a very difficult thing for the Israeli society to accept. Of course, most Israelis understand that this is a price that Israel has to pay in order to see the hostages coming back, but regardless, it is a very high price, and therefore all these questions will have to be answered by tomorrow afternoon. For the moment, the Israeli government is in consultations how to relate to this list, which on the one hand is a breach of the ceasefire agreement, on the other hand will bring 4 women soldiers back. A lot of sentences, a lot of questions, a lot of hopes on one hand and concerns on the other hand, and this shows exactly what Israel was preparing for, the very difficult stage, the very difficult position that this whole agreement puts Israel in. On one hand, a lot of hope. On the other hand, great concern.
Jonathan, thank you for that. Our correspondent Jonathan Regev in Tel Aviv.
In other news, the Bank of Japan has raised interest rates to their highest level in 17 years as it moves in the opposite direction to much of the world. Board members voted to move away from the ultra-low rates, lifting the short-term policy rate a quarter point to around 0.5%. Now, it comes after the price of Japan's core consumer goods rose by 3% in December on the previous year, the fastest growth in 16 months. Following the decision, the Japanese yen strengthened by 0.6% to trade at over 155 against the dollar. And Japan's benchmark Nikkei 225 index shared early gains after the announcement to end the day down 0.07%. Now, Dr. Seiji Takeshita is a professor at the University of Shizuoka's School of Management and Information. He gave us his thoughts about how the rate hike would impact the Japanese economy.
Well, I would say this is more like normalization of the rates. People talk about rate rise, but this is really a normalization. And from that context, yes, we are getting back to normalized state. But that said, of course, there's quite a lot of external ambiguity factors, particularly from the United States with the new president. So this is something that we all have to watch very carefully. And of course, BOJ itself is also watching very carefully, because that basically could evoke so many of the unexpected type of volatility.
Deflation, a major ongoing issue for Japan. Can Japan see the back of it now?
Well, yes, we've already achieved, what the BOJ saw as a goal of 2% on CPI, and we are expected to see continuous rise in the wage side and inflation, because in our case, it's cost-push inflation. It's not as serious as demand pull inflation that you see in the United States or United Kingdom. So people do feel that, it's fairly under control. I have a bit of doubts about that, but, that's one of the reasons why BOJ have decided to normalize the rates. And from that perspective, yes, we are coming back on the normal track.
And with this rate decision, what does it mean for ordinary businesses, ordinary consumers in Japan?
Well, actually, it's, I would say, a pretty negative news from MNEs. I should say more like mid-sized, small-sized Japanese companies. And the reason for this is that they're very much relying on indirect financing, in other words, financing from the banks. And these medium and small-sized enterprises, for that reason, will have more burden on the interest side. And also, they're much reliant on the borrowing. So, from that perspective, it would be negative for these companies. But again, this is normalization. One would expect that, it would basically decrease the, I would say, the rates between the United States and Japan, therefore inducing, stronger yen. Thus, we'll be able to avoid, further pressure from inflation, which I think is a very optimistic scenario. And my reasoning for this is because I don't think the interest rate gap will be lessened as many people expect, particularly as we are facing upper house election in Japan in the summertime. And also due to the fact that, as I just explained, a lot of mid-sized and small enterprises politically would not like the rate rise.
And how do you think this move aligns Japan's central bank now with other major central banks?
I don't think the Bank of Japan has the same maneuverability or capability as the Fed or the European Central Bank. They don't have the deep pocket as many people think. Considering the fact that the current account has reached well over 600 trillion yen, raise of interest rate itself is shooting our own foot. And basically, from many of the political and economic reasons, it's very difficult for them to really maneuver, their policies.
China says it's never deliberately pursued a trade surplus with the United States. Those comments by the Foreign Ministry were made after President Trump accused Beijing of unfair practices.
China acknowledged differences between the two sides, but said they share common interests. Trump has described his conversation with Chinese President Xi Jinping last week as friendly, and he's now appeared to roll back on his election promise, saying he would rather not impose tariffs on China.
President Trump has demanded a cut in U.S. interest rates, renewing his rather fractious relationship with monetary policymakers. The Federal Reserve has indicated that rates could be held steady for the short term. Trump told reporters he expects to be listened to. Our correspondent John Terrett is at the New York Stock Exchange. John, what are President Trump's chances of influencing the Fed's thinking on interest rates?
Well, probably 0 to none if I'm honest with you. But, I mean, this man just makes headlines. I said to you yesterday that he would, and boy, oh boy, did he, doing this virtual with Davos. And there are headlines being made here which I don't think have even made it to the international wires, which I'll try to tell you about. One of the things he said yesterday regarding interest rates was that I know more about interest rates than Chairman Powell, the head of the central bank, or something like that anyway. And he also said, I will lower interest rates. Well, this is calling into question the relationship between the White House and the Federal Reserve, which is just down the road on Constitution Avenue there in Washington, D.C., because the bank is supposed to be independent. They are the ones that make up their mind whether interest rates go up or they go down, depending on the data presented to them. Now, in the election campaign, Trump did say quite often that he would favor, as president, getting involved in the decision-making process, again saying that he knows more about interest rates as a businessman than many of the people actually around the table. But it is causing a little bit of angst here at the moment. So we'll have to see how it goes. Next week, the Federal Reserve meets, and the feeling on Wall Street is that they will not lower interest rates next week after doing it twice in a row. Next week they won't. They'll pause. Well, Trump doesn't want that. He wants rates to come down, a way of stimulating the economy. So we'll just have to see what happens. Of course, he demanded lower interest rates, not just for the domestic market, but for countries around the world when he did this virtual with Davos yesterday. He demanded lower oil prices, targeting Saudi and OPEC. The interesting thing is that America doesn't import so much oil from Saudi anymore. Most of it comes from Canada and from Mexico. So what else comes in is relatively... But he sees all of this as key to dragging down inflation, which is a key campaign promise for him. I thought very interesting as well, he said a couple of other things which made headlines here. He said that he sought fair ties with China, which I haven't heard him say it that way before. Maybe I've missed something, but I haven't heard that before. And as you say, he said he'd rather not tariff China. It's looking like 10% now rather than the 60% that it appeared to be out on the campaign trail. And then he attacked the Bank of America and JP Morgan Chase, two of the biggest banks, naming the CEOs of these banks and saying that they don't serve conservatives or Republicans. Well, there's been a rumor going around for a long time that this is happening. I don't think it's true. I think probably these accounts get closed down for various other reasons. Both the Bank of America and JP Morgan Chase said, oh, we're not targeting conservatives, we're not targeting Republicans, we're quite happy to have everybody's business. But the point is, the man called them out on international television with the whole world watching. Quite extraordinary, really. And finally, the other thing he did yesterday, when he left the TV studio where he was, he went back to the Oval and he signed a crypto executive order, which does two things. It creates a digital asset stockpile, and under the guidance of the incoming crypto czar, it will create a framework, a path for the US to have its own cryptocurrency coin. It'll be a stable coin, I expect, linked to the dollar. The markets are down today, the Dow by 1/5%. The S&P 500 has been in record territory, but is now not anymore. They're trying for a fifth day of gains. And President Trump has just landed in North Carolina, where he's seeing victims of Hurricane Helene with flooding. And then he's flying on to Los Angeles to see the victims of the fires there.
John, big legal story making headlines there. It's a big business story as well, of course, this huge settlement from a massive pharmaceutical company relating to America's opioid crisis.
Yes, and this is a very American story. It hasn't happened anywhere else in the world. A couple of years ago, they changed the rules. Doctors used to be able to prescribe opioids for only cancer. That's so if you're unlucky enough to have cancer, then you could get an opioid drug. They changed the rules so that you could prescribe it for a headache or a finger ache or a backache. And there's a company in Connecticut called Purdue Pharmaceutical who glammed onto this and decided to market what amounted really to heroin in a sugar pill. It was all quite legal, quite legal. And of course, some people got amazing relief from this. They were delighted. Other people got addicted because heroin is a very, very addictive product. And they called it OxyContin. The problem was, prescribed these drugs would then leave them in medicine cabinets where teenagers found them, tried them, and also got addicted. And this was a nationwide scandal. They called it the drawing room crisis because these were relatively well-off teenagers to relatively well-off families who were getting addicted to this stuff. And of course the families could help them out financially. It was all behind closed doors, but thousands of people died and thousands of people got very, very sick. Then there was a deal, but the deal was done through the bankruptcy court, and the Supreme Court of the United States nixed it because they said the bankruptcy court had overreached its authority. Now today, a new settlement, Purdue Pharmaceutical and the people that control them, the Sackler family, are stumping up $7.4 billion. It's about $1 billion more than under the old deal. The money will go to the states, to local governments, and to the thousands of families who lost children and other loved ones. It does need court approval, but we expect the Trump administration not to get in the way, and any families that wish to come out of this deal, which is a class action deal, and sue the Sackler family individually, I understand will be able to do so, but not until after February.
John, thank you for that. Our correspondent John Terrace at the New York Stock Exchange.
China says it's ready to work with the Netherlands to safeguard a reliable global supply chain. Vice Premier Ding Xuexiang has been meeting with Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof. Ding said Beijing hopes the Netherlands will continue to provide an equitable business environment for Chinese companies. Schoof said there is huge potential for trade between both countries.
Tesla says it'll fix safety issues in over 1 million of its vehicles in China by issuing a software update. Problems have been reported with power steering and rear view cameras in around half of all Teslas sold in China. Similar problems have led to recalls in the United States.
Shares in luxury fashion brand Burberry are up more than 10% despite its revenues having fallen over the past year. The firm claims a brand reset in November is having a positive impact and has slowed the decline in customer purchases. The Burberry Forward strategy was launched 3 months ago after sales plummeted in the first half of 2024.
The UK has agreed an $11 billion defence contract with Rolls-Royce. The British firm will design and make the nuclear reactors that power Royal Navy submarines for the next 8 years. This all comes as US President Trump called for NATO members to spend 5% of their GDP on defence. The UK has pledged to boost defence spending to 2.5%, but has not outlined the timetable.
Italian bank Monte dei Paschi di Siena has announced plans to take over Mediobanca in a move that could reshape the country's lending sector. The bid, worth just under $14 billion, would see Italy's oldest bank taking control of its larger peer. The valuation is 5% higher than Mediobanca's closing share price on Thursday.
The makers of ChatGPT is reportedly preparing to launch a new platform to automate routine tasks like booking your holiday or buying your shopping. OpenAI says the feature called Operator will learn the habits and bookings of users to replicate them. Initially, Operator will only be available to ChatGPT Pro users in the United States before a wider rollout.
China's foreign minister has told the new US Secretary of State that Taiwan will never be allowed to separate from China. Wang Yi and Marco Rubio's telephone conversation follows a call between President Xi Jinping and Donald Trump last week. China's foreign ministry says that Rubio told Wang that the United States does not support Taiwan independence.
The head of the European Central Bank has called on EU leaders to get their act together and boost economic growth because of what she described as existential threats.
Christine Lagarde was speaking at the World Economic Forum in the Swiss town of Davos.
People are going to have to rethink with the prism of confidence, with the prism of cost, as is often the case, and the prism of opportunities. And there is no question that what is happening outside is a challenge, but it's also a big opportunity for revisiting and deciding whether or not Europe wants to be a key player. But I'm contending that it has the talent, and it has the means, and it has the ambition.
Let's talk to our correspondent, Juliet Mann, who's in Davos. Juliet, what else did the head of the European Central Bank have to say?
Christine Lagarde responded to accusations by Donald Trump that the EU is treating the US unfairly. She said the focus should be on negotiation and mutual respect rather than this fixation on trade figures. She said that Europe could import disillusioned US talent and that Europe really should stop being so pessimistic about its economy. You know, Jamie and Paul, a lot of the discussions here have been around the health of the global economy and on trade flows. So it was quite fitting that one of the last sessions on this final fifth day of Davos was the US-China-EU triangle. Lots of high-level discussion about economic dependencies between the three blocs and also discussions about where that relationship will go. And one of those panellists was Belén Garijo. She's the CEO of the German company Merck. It's a German science and technology company that's investing heavily in China. And that's something she focused on when I spoke to her here in Davos.
So our core business is making, in biopharma, is making a significant percentage of our presence. But China is changing as well, right? And is becoming much closer to a developed market which is going to be driven by innovation. So we are developing our oncology portfolio in China as well. We are partnering with Chinese companies. We have used each and every opportunity to in-license from very highly innovative Chinese companies. I believe that China is a big, promising country in terms of innovation and a growth opportunity for our three businesses.
What does your focus on China mean, though, for your strategy with Europe and other parts of the world?
At this time, we are evaluating how do we evolve our China for China approach and become even more local in China. But we are also evaluating what we call China for global. I am absolutely convinced that innovative companies that have originated in China will have the aspiration to globalize. So we need to understand what it means for us. How can we really partner and benefit from all the innovation that is emerging from China for our global business?
I can't hear you, but perhaps you can hear me. And you'll recall that the big overriding theme here in Davos has been collaboration for the intelligent age, with a particular focus on artificial intelligence. And the Davos set here have been looking at ways to make it all joined up, to have global conversations about AI regulation. But Alexandra Feisal, who is the State Secretary for Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, said to do that, you just need to look back in history.
In the 1860s, when the telegraph was invented, the French called for an international conference to regulate what are we going to do with that technology, the telegraph. Switzerland was had a tiny little diplomatic service back then. The federal state was founded in 1848, so very small diplomacy. And nobody who knew what the telegraph was. So the federal government then asked professors from the Federal Polytechnic in Zurich. They knew what it was because they were engineers and technologists. And so they were disguised as Swiss diplomats and went to this conference in Paris, out of which was created the International Telegraph Union, the ITU, which later became the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. So technology has always been at the very center of diplomacy. So, and now again, that's what we are living now again. And so we need to discuss how can we cooperate internationally to understand and develop those technologies. We need to work together in order to make sure that those technologies can also be used for the global commons. And we need to discuss how they should be regulated or not. So this is, again, a constant of diplomacy is technology and science.
Well, business leaders here and big thinkers have been highlighting the need to strengthen partnerships to really shape a sustainable and intelligent future. I spoke to Sanya Nishtar, who's the CEO of Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, about the power of collaboration when it comes to addressing some of the world's most difficult health challenges.
Within a month of the emergency being declared, we were able to order the largest consignment of vaccines. That wasn't the case when COVID-19 had struck, because months elapsed before the funding was raised in order to catalyze the development of vaccines and place orders for them. So during MPOX, we acted very rapidly. But this is not a time for countries, regional entities, and global institutions to be complacent. We need to make sure that we are completely aligned on what needs to happen when an emergency strikes. There is no room for competitive behaviors. We must put our egos in our handbags. We must learn to collaborate a lot better.
I love that line. I think that's the line of Davos for me. Put your egos in your handbags. But you know, what we've heard about here in Davos 2025 is about the health, an update, a health check, if you like, about Europe's economy and the potential that's there. We've had an insight into what Donald Trump's second administration is going to mean for global trade. We talked about the opportunities and the challenges when it comes to AI. We've heard that from the United Nations, pointing the finger at big oil in particular, saying that they're backsliding on green commitments. And more than ever, we've heard the voice of the Global South. So there has been a lot of insightful discussion, a lot of big conversations, a lot for global leaders and the political and economic elite to think about as they now wind their way back down the mountains and back to their real lives. Jamie and Paul.
Juliet, thank you for that. Enjoy the train ride back. Our correspondent, Juliet Mann, in Davos. Well, against the snowy backdrop of Davos, a tribute to the melting glaciers and the fragile natural world. The cellist Yo-Yo Ma performed to delegates at the World Economic Forum, dedicating this performance to the climate crisis. The environmental group behind the event said they hoped this music would inspire an emotional energy among business and political leaders to prioritize environmental policies.
And the headlines again. The Bank of Japan raises the cost of borrowing to the highest level in 17 years after consumer prices rise in December.
Our other headlines: President Trump tells monetary policymakers that he wants United States rates to be cut, reviving his rather fractious relationship with the Fed.
And that is it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Facebook, Instagram and TikTok.
And you can go to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's our special series, Traces of China. We'll see you again next week. Same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.